Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Inspirate, the show that is here to empower you, to enlighten you, to provide you with the inspiration in terms of the latest and hottest topics that are impacting our lives. Season 5 is focused on providing a new norm, a post-COVID world, looking at how COVID has come in and ravaged our society from social aspects, from an economic perspective. We understand the reality. People have lost jobs. Businesses are going under. So what is it that we can do? We need to usher in hope for our people. What is it that we can do differently to bring in a better world? We know that COVID has come in as almost a mirror for us. We see in the streets people going hungry. There's income inequality. We have this large gap between the haves and the have-nots. And so we've identified key panelists to be able to assist us in terms of looking at this topic and looking at how, and specifically business as a driver for this new economy. So from a Zoom perspective, we've connected with Dr. Azhar Jamin, who's the Chief Economist of Econometrics. Welcome, Dr. Jamin.
As-salamu alaikum to you.
Wa alaikum salam. Great stuff. Well, lovely to have you on the show. We also have Fatima Vauda from 274, who's an investment manager. She's out in Rosebank. Fatima, welcome.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Okay, Dr. Jamin, we'll start with you, right? Can we continue on the same trajectory that we have been on? This is from a global perspective. You as an economist have been watching this economy for a long time, right? Pre-democracy, from an apartheid perspective, right through to democracy, this last 26 years. And we look at where we are right now. We in quite a situation where we need to be doing things differently. Can we do things differently? That's the question.
I think we have to try and do things differently. The problem that we confront is that the pressure has been on the world's governments and central banks to do something to prevent the normal pattern of boom and bust from reappearing. And in the interim, what we've also had is, in the last 3 decades, a surge in information technology, which has enabled the financial sector to start creating products that have previously not been available, financial products. And this has facilitated a huge surge in debt levels of both companies and individuals. And what has happened in the interim is, of course, this built up into a bit of a climax in 2008, 2009, and to prevent a much deeper fallout from global economic activity, the world's fiscal and monetary authorities have embarked upon an even bigger spate of stimulus, which is creating all sorts of problems. The most blatant of all, in my opinion, is that it has boosted financial asset prices way beyond what one would normally have expected, and conversely, not done all that much to help the man in the street. The result has been a huge increase in inequality between the haves and the have-nots, those with financial assets who have benefited increasingly from the world of the last few decades, and the ordinary man in the street who has not seen such a benefit. Of course, that has not been prevalent in every society. In Asia, just through sheer economic growth, they've managed to overcome some of these problems, but especially in the likes of South Africa, but also Europe and especially North America, we have seen this growing inequality that one believes cannot continue. Now, the amazing thing about the COVID-19 crisis and the solutions found are that they have exacerbated those inequalities even more.
Yes, and we'll talk a lot about this, investment bubble, you may call it, and this great debt that has been created in the world through these stimulus packages, and we'll touch a lot around that. But let's just focus on this income inequality, this large gap, or also what they call this Gini coefficient. And I believe South Africa is one of the largest in terms of the Gini coefficient. This gap between the haves and the have-nots that we talk about. Just from a layman's perspective, when you just look out there and you see that people living in laps of luxury, and then you see people that are starving, don't have food on the table, that impacts you, from just a soul perspective. Fatima, just to share some light on this income inequality, what is your perspective?
Yeah, 100%. Our Gini coefficient is currently sitting at around 63. South Africa is one of the highest levels of inequality. And if we think about what's happening, and Dr. Jamin touched a little bit on that, was the massive amount of global monetary and fiscal stimulus that's been pumped into global financial markets, is only making the rich richer. There's a famous French economist called Thomas Piketty, and he spoke about it. He speaks about it in this massive book that he's written, that he wrote a couple of years ago, where he talks about R being greater than G. So the rich will always get richer, and the poor will always get poorer, because what has all this stimulus done? It's only skyrocketing share prices and making the rich richer, whilst the poor get isolated and kicked out of the system. If you just consider the South African environment and the impact of COVID coming into following February and March, we've potentially lost, it's estimated that we've lost close to 1 million jobs over that period. There's about 340,000 small businesses that are negatively impacted as a result of this. And all of that, the only thing that does is it exacerbates our economic crisis. Coming into 2020, we already came in on a weak footing after a decade of poor economic growth. The period from 2010 to 2020, there was a recent graph that was produced by the South African National Treasury, which shows that it was one of the worst decades that South Africa's ever experienced from a growth perspective. We were really hoping that some of the reforms and the structural reforms that our president and his team were putting in place would see some form of economic recovery. Unfortunately, COVID has pushed us all the way back. And I would say that South Africa's positioning at the current moment is particularly dire. And I think we are in trouble, and we've got to deal with that situation, and we've got to come together to deal with it. But we really need the political and economic will to implement, and that's one of the most frustrating things in South Africa, is our total lack of ability to implement.
Yes, look, it's a lot of doom and gloom that we're speaking about, and look, it's reality. And we need to face that reality. And so before we go down to some sort of solutions and work around what we can do, I think let's just assess a little bit more. You touched on this last decade around how we've regressed as an economy, as a nation. And if we now to assess how did we get to where we are, if we can maybe just, I think the only way we can actually work out solutions moving forward is that if we really understand the problem. Is it as simple as saying that this last 10 years, everyone talks about corruption? Can we simplify it and say, because of the corruption, that's the reason we're in the situation we are? Or is it a global economy that also is structurally a problem that allows for this income inequality to just perpetuate? Dr. Jamin?
To some extent, it's a bit of both. one has to recognize that it's this massive monetary stimulus that has been invoked over the past decade has itself spurned the notion, especially with asset prices rising so quickly, that, you know, if you do things the right way, in other words, the corrupt way, you can make money quite easily and quite quickly. And to some extent, some would argue that it's this flood of liquidity into the world economy that has inspired corrupt practices, not only in South Africa, but in many other countries. South Africa has been particularly badly hit, partly because as a result of the legacies of apartheid, a large section of the population was excluded from enrichment in the past and found all sorts of means to try and jump onto the bandwagon with the availability of liquidity to do so. And I would say that corruption has had a very substantial role to play in the relative decline of the South African economy over the past decade. Estimates vary between 500 billion and over 1 trillion rand that has been lost due to corruption. And when you boil that down to the fiscal metrics of the country, you realize that we could have been in so much more, in such a more sound, fundamental economic condition right now, had it not been for the loss of all those resources that went to just a handful of people's pockets and left the majority of the people lagging behind.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so we come into the end of the first segment, and if we can just summarize, we understand that we have major challenges, a combination of a global economic system that's built in such a way that pushes lots of cash into the system, and that just perpetuates this gap between the rich and the poor. We as a country have also not done ourselves much favors. We have this last 10 years that Fatima speaks about, this lost years, this lost decade, in terms of corruption, in terms of wastage, in terms of not being able to grow this economy. And I think after the break, let's focus on how we can grow this economy, if we can grow this economy. Welcome back to Inspirate. We have a wonderful topic, how business can be the driver for the economy. We have two esteemed guests in Fatima Vauda from 274, and we have Dr. Azar Jammine, who is the chief economist for Econometrics. We've been talking about some of the challenges we're facing as a country, as a globe. COVID has come in, has acted as a catalyst to get us to where we are. We looked at some of the reasons for this income inequality. But let's now focus around what can we do differently. I think that's the focus for this series. Or can we do things differently? To be able, is it just doom and gloom? Or is there a different way that we can approach the economy, our social lives, in terms of creating a more abundant life for all South Africans, for people on the globe? Dr. Jammine?
One needs to come to answer this from two directions. One is the global macro system, the monetary system around the world, what can be done to try and alleviate the world's economic problems through other means. And then there's, of course, the domestic issues. And I think if from a macro point of view, I don't know that the world has yet devised a system of preventing cyclical economic downturns in manners other than through just this huge stimulus that has, as I say, created other problems of its own and is in a sense kicking the can down the road as far as the global economic growth goes. Domestically, of course, there are many other factors that have also contributed towards the rise in inequality. The most important of all, and you asked what can be done to try and alleviate the situation, is the massive disparity in education of different sections of the population. And that's obviously began with the legacies of apartheid, where a large section of the population was discriminated against in terms of the quality of education that it could aspire to. But very little has really evolved since then. Many would argue that we've gone backwards in terms of exacerbating the inequalities of education. And that is creating a huge further knock-on effect in terms of inequality. You've got, for example, people who come from rural areas who are very poor. They don't have the means to educate themselves, to bring themselves into the mainstream of the economy. Conversely, the wealthier sections can afford to send their children to private schools and bypass the failures of the public school system that way, and therefore, and through that, generate excellence in terms of the quality of education that their children can actually aspire to. They can also send their children overseas to get even better postgraduate qualifications. And those people come back to South Africa or get postgraduate qualifications in South Africa, and they take the top jobs through their ability, and they can earn the most income. Your guy who comes from the rural areas, a poor rural background, who hasn't been able to climb onto that bandwagon, just gets left behind. And so you have this chicken and egg situation of inequality through education. And the government has been singularly unable to actually address that problem properly. And when you come to the COVID crisis specifically, there have been further inequalities created, firstly, by the fact that the measures that were taken to combat the spread of the virus, such as allowing big retail stores to stay open, but smaller retailers having had to shut down, exacerbated inequality from that direction. We're also seeing unequal access to healthcare, which is also exacerbating the situation. We also saw the government clamping down on informal activity during the lockdown so as to limit the spread of the virus. Again, that really jeopardized the plight of the poorest sections of the population. So it's a multifaceted problem that we encounter, let alone to speak of the huge increase in inequality generated by the manner in which corporate executive remuneration has been affected around the world, and in South Africa in particular, over the last 3 decades. It links very much to this whole flood of liquidity, and it also derives from the growing break in the relationship between ownership and control of companies, the evolution of unit trusts around the world, whereby the big power and apologies to Fatima, a lot of power has now been vested in asset managers instead of the owners of businesses to decide on how these businesses should be run. And these asset managers put huge pressure on their boards of directors to remunerate the executives of those companies very handsomely with stretched targets, so that if they achieve those targets, they get massive bonuses. And the result has been a multi-fold, 30-fold increase in the disparity between the remuneration of your chief executives, for example, and the lower levels of your ordinary workers, exacerbating inequality through that method as well.
Yeah, so, you know, if you, hearing what you're saying, I mean, if from a stimulus perspective, just in terms of money being put into the system to try and reignite the system, what you're saying is that that in itself creates more of this income inequality, because that money ends up going into the hands of a few at the expense of the many. And then you have this education problem, which again, the haves are able to send children to the best schools, and so again, it exacerbates the problem. So you have this larger income inequality. Then from a business perspective, you get in the larger enterprises who have the cash flows to be able to operate, so they leverage off the opportunities that come with somewhat of a chaotic environment because they're able to navigate through all of this, yeah? And you have the smaller guys who are falling off the wayside. And then, of course, even from a corporate perspective, as you've mentioned, lastly, is that you get in the executives being remunerated handsomely. And so what that ends up happening is that you just get in this gap larger and larger. Fatima, what's your view on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're living under strange circumstances, but the financial sector in South Africa has gone through, has evolved rapidly in the past kind of 40 years. And in my view, you know, we always talk, we reflect back on the golden era, which was the period post-democracy and just before the global financial crisis, where we had buoyant markets, where we had around 700 shares listed on the JSE. You know, we saw a lot of new listings. We saw a lot of international capital come into our market. GDP doubled in dollar terms. Our debt to GDP ratio almost halved. You know, we got an investment grade rating, and it was a fantastic golden period. You know, we're sitting in a period where, you know, everything has fallen kind of apart. Our debt to GDP has more than doubled over the period. Foreign direct investment has declined. And we're sitting in a situation where a lot of emerging economies such as ourselves need to compete for international capital. And we need to fix things if we want to compete for that international capital. And for me, as a business person, you know, I find a couple of things about South Africa incredibly frustrating. And one of them is, you know, the ease of doing business. The ease of doing business, I mean, just think about it. We dropped from around the 30, 35 level in 2008 all the way to around close to 90. We're sitting at currently at 84 in terms of the ease of doing business. Too much red tape. We've got a serious energy crisis in South Africa. I mean, you know, our electricity supply is really impacting our growth potential. I mean, just today, it's between lockdown, between, you know, not having any power to actually work. It's incredibly difficult to achieve any kind of productivity in an environment such as the one we're living through. And the ease of doing business, you know, dealing with, you know, there's so much difficulty. You know, we're working with a lot of SMMEs at the moment, and there's so much difficulty in starting a new business. There's so much difficulty with getting credit in this market. You know, registering properties, all of these things speaks to the ease of doing business. And if we cannot navigate that kind of challenge, we have a big problem on our hands. And again, you know, we speak to this ratio of human capital to productivity. The South African public sector wage bill is eating up our expense budget on top of our interest rate costs that we're paying to finance all of our sovereign debt holders. And if you look at the productivity gains achieved from this massive public sector workforce, you know, we've got nothing. We have not received our bang for our buck from the public sector workforce. You know, their salaries have been growing much faster than the private sector salaries. And, you know, we find ourselves in a situation now where we'd rather go towards a prescribed asset than to deal with the fundamental challenges, because we're scared that if we go to the IMF or we go to the World Bank to plug in our deficit, they're going to place an enormous amount of restrictions on our expenditure, and we'd rather not do that. So, you know, and then lastly, you know, I keep on talking about this global competitiveness. If we're going to require, you know, we need foreign direct investment, we need international capital. But again, we're not sufficiently competitive to attract foreign direct capital. You know, we ranked very low amongst other uncertainty with regards to land rights, with regards to transparency, with regards to corruption, politically exposed people. You know, we've got very low dynamism amongst South African businesses. So we have a lot of challenges. We have to deal with the reality of the situation. And, you know, we've got to have that will to be able to overcome these problems.
Yeah, I think on that point on the will, and do we have the will? That's the question. Do we have the will? I think with all that you guys have been mentioning, I mean, there's a myriad of challenges that we faced with, a myriad of challenges and quite complex challenges that if you put them all together, you know, one may look at it and say, and speaking to a lot of friends and people, business people out there, guys are worried. People are concerned. They're saying, is there, I mean, I know economists talk of green shoots, Dr. Jamin. You know, are there any green shoots? Is there hope? So what we'll do is, we've run out of time on this segment. Immediately after the break, what we'll do is try and roll up our sleeves and look at some of the solutions. Let's introspect and see what are the strengths that we have. We understand some of our weaknesses, the opportunities that may be out there. Let's look at ourselves and see what can we do that can grow this economy, that can create a better life for all. Immediately after the break, we'll focus on some solutions. Welcome back to Inspirate. We hope you're enjoying the show. We hope you actually enjoying our new set. Thanks to Enza Home, who have sponsored our beautiful set. And as per usual, we always try and bring you the best of panelists, best of topics that are relevant. And we're dealing with how business can be a driver for the economy. We focused in the last two segments on some of the challenges, and our guests have really expressed quite a reality, you know, what one may term doom and gloom in terms of where we are as a country within a global context. But I want to shift focus a little bit, and I want to get to some of the potential solutions, potential interventions that we can look at of how we can get out of this quagmire in terms of building a better life for all. Dr. Jamin, maybe I'll leave it to you, and maybe you can share some light in terms of what would you see as you know, pointers in terms of where we can start in terms of working on this new economy, a different way of working that can help all South Africans. I think our president speaks about an inclusive economy. How do we get everyone included in this economy, working together? Fatima mentioned the will. And if we all working together, how can we work toward a better life for each?
Yes, and you are absolutely correct in highlighting this topic. The fact is that the South African economy's relative performance was in decline long before the COVID-19 virus hit us. And that was due to a number of structural impediments. And these need to be addressed and overcome. The first, and Fatima and I myself have referred to some of these in terms of the lack of appropriate educational outcomes that I spoke about. In Fatima's case, talking about a bloated public service wage bill that is crowding out the ability to spend on uplifting the majority of people. But over and above that, we mentioned corruption. Absolutely critical. We need to try and get rid of corruption. And thus far, we have had high hopes that the National Prosecuting Authority would be able to step in and bring perpetrators of corrupt practices to book. But Shamila Batoy, the head of the NPA herself, virtually admitted a week or two ago that it was almost an impossible task to achieve. Because at every turn, there are interest groups that are acting against the processes that are aimed at trying to root out corruption. President Ramaphosa himself when he became president, climbed on the bandwagon and said he wanted to root out corruption. We've seen absolutely, virtually no positive action of people being brought to book. We've got the Zondo Commission, we've got the NPA under a new leadership, and yet nothing has really come to fruition in that regard. And of course, it feeds into one huge fault line in the South African economy at the moment, and that is the total inefficiency and incompetence of state-owned enterprises. There are many of them, and every single one that you actually look at has got them wrong with it, and is proving to be a huge burden on the ability of the state to finance them. And, you know, what action has been taken to try and overcome them? One of the simplest ways of actually improving accountability, competence, efficiency, and governance in state-owned enterprises is to bring in private shareholders, either through wholesale privatization, or if you're against that concept, just have partial equity ownership by private interests. As soon as you have that, those private interests are in it for their own profitability, and therefore would make quite sure that these businesses are run properly and do not act as a huge sieve for government finances through which money is poured down the drain, so to speak. Then you have the whole question, just to go a little further with the point that Fatima mentioned of the bloated public service. What's been happening over the last decade is an increasing amount of government spending has gone towards financing the public service, and that has squeezed its ability to fund infrastructural investment in capital projects that can provide goods and services to the general public more efficiently. Capital investment has declined whilst consumption investment has been increasing. Clearly, we need to address that, and at the moment, the government encouragingly seems to be identifying increasing infrastructural investment as the route through which to enable the economy to recover post-COVID, and produced a document for debate on Friday in this regard. But the immediate retort by experts that I've had any dealings with in that, I was in a webinar, was, but we've seen it all before. Why hasn't the government done this in the past? They said they were going to do it, and it hasn't come to fruition. And a lot of that has to do with let me carry on with the one other big fault line is labor and industrial relations. On account of the lack of diminution of inequality, or rather the increased inequality, partly as a result of excess global liquidity, partly as a result of inadequacies of our educational system, you're having just the handful of educated and trained people taking the best jobs, earning the best salaries, and the workers are left behind. So they become more militant. And you have this we and they syndrome that is not conducive towards improved economic activity. Now, where does the government sit in all this? Unfortunately, we have two fault lines overseeing the way the government is dealing with this. On the one hand, you have the fault line caused by the split within the government between the ideology of using market-oriented policies and processes to ameliorate the situation, and the other side that says we need more, not less government involvement, more regulation, speaking to the point that Fatima Baude made of too much regulation stifling business activity. And certainly through the Zuma era, there was a huge polemical standoff between those who were favoring market-oriented systems, primarily the private sector, and your public sector interests who treated the private sector as the enemy. Now you get President Ramaphosa entering the fray, trying to bring the two parties closer together, and he's running into a headwind, the second big fault line, factionalism within the ruling party that doesn't allow for a rapprochement between those two segments, and for that matter, factionalism that is exacerbating racial tensions and tensions between the haves and the have-nots in the country, exacerbating them still further. And the president ideally should be taking the lead in overcoming those fissures, but politically can't do so because the ruling party seems to be split down the middle between those in favor and those against the two sides of the potential solutions. And so what happens is paralysis and no policies advances to sort out the problem.
That's quite a mouthful. And I mean, if you look at President Ramaphosa's situation with all these different dynamics, these challenges, as well as issues that he's faced with in his own party, it's not an easy job. The question then is, as South Africans watching and our viewers out there, somebody that's either employed and is concerned about whether he'll still or she will still have employment, a business that's potentially going under, youngsters that are getting into the workforce and are saying, are there opportunities for me to be able to leverage in terms of this economy? Is it all doom and gloom? Are there opportunities, Fatima? Can we do things differently? Where does business play a role? If we're saying government is kind of paralyzed, where does business, civic society, normal citizens come in and put pressure to say, let's work together as South Africans and try and build this economy? How do we do that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, business were very wary of the Zuma years, and we need to put it out there. In fact, businesses were sitting with a lot of cash on their balance sheets that they refused to invest in the South African economy because of the policy uncertainty that existed during the Zuma period, as well as the corruptive elements and the crime that existed over that period. And for that reason, we saw many South African JSE-listed companies invest a lot of their capital internationally as opposed to investing it in the South African economy. I mean, a couple of examples, Woolworths spent a lot of money buying David Jones in Australia. We saw some of our healthcare companies acquire hospitals in Europe and the UK. We saw investments being made in Africa. And our team has calculated that in excess of about 150 billion rands was spent by South African companies investing offshore as opposed to investing in the South African economy. And I can tell you, a lot of those companies failed in their offshore, in many of those offshore acquisitions, and are now selling a lot of those assets at fire sale prices. Now, can you imagine if all of that money was invested in the South African economy? And I think what is happening now is that business is recognized and are coming to the party. But business wants certainty from government on a couple of areas. So, we know that we've had poor educational outcomes for a long time now. We've got public sector health issues. We've got the policy uncertainty issue. Things like the mining charter, etc., placed a lot of doubt and difficulty for businesses to want to invest in the economy. We've got funding constraints, and most importantly, we've got this inefficient and redundant SOEs, and we've really got to deal with the SOEs. If business gets confidence from government on its ability to sort out these challenges, business wants to come to the party. There's a couple of initiatives where we're talking about blended finance initiatives, and President Ramaphosa held its infrastructure symposium about a month ago. He set up a dedicated infrastructure office at the presidency, and the idea behind this is for the private sector to partner with the public sector through blended finance opportunities to drive economic growth and job creation. And I think, that sweetener that if government comes to the party, the private sector comes to the party, and we can unlock a lot of opportunities across the board. I mean, if we just think about accelerating the digital economy and what that could, what the migration and the spectrum allocation, if government came to the party on that, what that would do and unlock a whole lot of value and opportunities. So,
Fatima, I'm just gonna interrupt you here. Look, you've got some great ideas. We're talking technology and with infrastructure drive. Let's take this after the break, and in the last segment, let's focus on these opportunities that we can use to drive the economy. Immediately after the break, we'll focus on some of the solutions. Welcome back. We were just listening to Fatima Vauda from 27-4, who was, and Dr. Jamin from Econometrics, the chief economist. And you were talking some of the fault lines in our economy, our challenges. It was quite a negative scenario that was painted and a reality. We cannot deny that is the reality of where we are as a nation within a global context. However, just before the break, Fatima, you were talking about some of the potential solutions, some of providing hope for our people. Maybe somebody getting into the job environment, a youngster watching, somebody that's in a business that needs to innovate and look at maybe where are the different opportunities. Think outside the box, take advantage of different opportunities that are being presented. Fatima?
Yeah, 100%. So basically where we are at the moment is that government together with business is identifying key sectors where we can stimulate the economy and where we believe that they are critical sectors for the future success of our economy and large activators of employment. So really what we're talking about is priority sectors where we could see blended finance opportunities where the private sector could get together with the public sector, where we could in fact crowd in foreign direct investment and have identified a whole list of sectors that we believe can really kickstart the economy. One, we've recognized that a priority area is to support small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly post the COVID environment. We're going to come into a space where at least 400,000 of these businesses are in dire need to be salvaged. So one of those critical areas is the informal economy and SMMEs. But then we're looking at the other areas where we're seeing a lot of opportunities from an infrastructure perspective is within energy and water, within mining, within construction, within manufacturing, within transport, agriculture, telecommunication, tourism. And so the ministry together with, the ministry has identified those sectors. What they're doing is that they're taking those projects to become project ready. And once they become project ready, investors would want to participate in those projects. And the way government crowds in a private sector investment is through providing some form of carrot and to matched funders. And I mean, we've successfully partnered with the National Treasury on such an initiative. The National Treasury allocated a grant to 27-4 to the tune of 200 million rand, where to crowd in 5 times matched funding, and they act as the first loss tranche. And our role is to facilitate job creation and invest in mid-market sectors of the economy with a target to fuel the economy. So those are the exciting type of efforts that are coming to the fore. And we hope that through these type of efforts, which is new to our market, which we historically referred to as public-private partnerships that worked well in emerging economies such as South Africa. And that's the direction that government is taking.
Yes, Dr. Jamin, I mean, if we look at where we are, and just taking that example Fatima mentioned, just where government gets involved with the private sector, that's a sort of a recipe, if I may call it, that we can use, a test bed a basis from which we can build these sectors, and through that bring in the smaller businesses, through that jobs get created, and in those various sectors that give us as a country a comparative advantage. Is that the route to go? I mean, if we don't have any other options, we need to leverage our private sector's balance sheets. I think that's what's been spoken of as well. And then government from a policy perspective, and just enabling all of this to happen. And then, yes, hopefully through that success, bring in the foreign direct investment that's so needed. Is that the basis to work from?
Without a doubt, that's a very significant basis to work from, and it's been singularly absent over the past decade because of the huge standoff between government and the private sector, and the unions for that matter. The challenge will be to see if we can improve the trust levels between those different segments of the economy to enable a program such as this to actually succeed. Let's hope that is the case, and we have to hope that is the case. But it would also go hand in hand with other initiatives. At this webinar that I was involved in on Friday, the point was made by Dr. Michael Sachs, the previous budget director in National Treasury, that it's all very well to talk of improving infrastructure and introducing all these projects, but if you can't actually administer the delivery of these services, then there's no point in having all this infrastructure. So it has to go hand in hand with improvements in the social administration of a lot of the way the economy is run. But there are some other new opportunities that have emerged in the post-COVID environment. As a result of COVID and the interruption of supply chains all around the world, starting when China was locked down and we couldn't get many of our components, you've had an increased drive back towards localization, almost back to the kind of initial phase of the sanctions environment, where of the 60s, where the South African economy industrialized itself like never before because it was cut off from the rest of the world. And now you're having an inclination of businesses, because of the fear of supply chain interruptions, to actually start developing products locally to replace imports. It will come at a cost of increased, the whole beauty of globalization was reducing cost structures around the world. This starts reversing that to some extent, but it does offer opportunities. We've already seen some of these emerging in terms of the supply of sanitizers and ventilators and medical equipment in the COVID environment. The second big area of opportunity lies in the healthcare sector, and this is worldwide, both in terms of the services that are provided, as well as in terms of the actual technology that is used. And healthcare is going to become increasingly digitized as we go through the next few years. Enormous opportunities there to get into that sector. Hand in hand with that, as we see now, is the growth of online education. And therein also lies huge growth opportunities and the provision of both hardware and software to complement these. Another big area of opportunity is obviously related to digitization and the digital economy, robotics, artificial intelligence, and everything that goes hand in hand with that. Huge opportunities that South Africa has not been able to exploit completely because of the inadequacy of our education in science and mathematics, and the ability to think in a logical manner that should have been produced by the educational system. On top of that, we've got new opportunities that have really come to the fore as a result of the lockdowns, where we've seen suddenly clear blue skies, animals all around, and birds all around where there were none before. The environment. And hand in hand with that environment is obviously the whole question of energy and clean energy, and waste management, another huge area. All those are wonderful new opportunities. The final one to take cognizance of, even in South Africa, is the increasing age profile demographically of the world. And the median age in South Africa has risen from 25 to 28 years over the past decade. And that means that ever more opportunities are going to be provided to provide for services for the aged, be it in terms of retirement planning, be it in terms of retirement homes, travel, whatever the case may be. Those are all opportunities that are still there for for young people to grab hold of. But the danger is that at the moment, some of the older sections of society, especially your middle-aged membership of the trade unions, are almost acting as a block against young people wanting to advance.
Thank you. Those are some wonderful opportunities. Amidst all the doom and gloom, at least we have a lot of hope. Just in closing, there's a few minutes that we have left. I'm going to leave it to you guys. Just some message from your perspective, your wealth of experience, your expertise, being involved so directly in the economy from a business perspective, from a strategic policy perspective. What would be your parting words, Fatima, to our viewers? South Africans, may they be the aged, may they be those that are working, may they be business people, may they be youngsters that are about to enter the economy. What are your views for our viewership in terms of South Africa in the future?
Every generation has its own crisis. And I want to go back to what Winston Churchill once said, and I think that's what he said: never let a good crisis go to waste. So what this crisis is allowing us is really a great opportunity to rethink the future of South Africa and how we can, trigger the Control-Alt-Delete button again to say, how do we kickstart everything on a different footnote to achieve that accelerated economic recovery that is inclusive. It has to be inclusive. It's got to embrace all South Africans. And how can we work together to achieve that? I think the plans are all there. We have enough plans. We have enough committees and subcommittees and this organization and that organization. There's too many at the moment. And all we want is people need to put their heads down and get the job done.
Great stuff.
And
Great stuff.
That's the message that I'm pushing through aggressively wherever I'm involved, and I'm involved in several different kind of forums together with government and the private sector. And it's, enough of the talk shop. Get your hands dirty and get the job done.
And it's so fresh coming, it's so refreshing coming from a woman and a young woman at that, telling us that, that we can, reboot and get our hands dirty and build this country. Some last words, parting words from you, Dr. Jammine, providing some sort of
from a young woman to an old man, now to who has seen quite a lot, and I suppose that is what gives me comfort. I have seen when things have been really very bleak, you somehow. One shouldn't underestimate the ingenuity of man to cope with these things. And in particular in South Africa, one shouldn't underestimate the willingness of South Africans to rally together to actually deal with a crisis when things really get bad. And I think we're starting to approach that level. I mean, I lived through the 80s and early 90s in this country when the outlook was so bleak, one couldn't see a way out. And all of a sudden, the Berlin Wall fell, and the bell was released for this country to start finding a new path. And I am convinced that the same thing is going to happen in the next few years. The one thing I would appeal to, though, for South African society, obsess the need for education, training, and upliftment with all the passion that you can muster. And do not rely on handouts or all the time and reliance on a higher authority to resolve your problems. Try and solve your problems by yourself and do it through developing your mind and the ability of your mind to actually find solutions to those problems, including your own financial management.
There we go. Thank you, Dr. Jamin. Thank you, Fatima. We obviously focused on a lot of the challenges, but we left our viewers with a lot of the opportunities and actually a challenge in itself. Dr. Jamin left us with this crux that if we focus on ourselves, what can we do? We have the power within ourselves. In terms of educating ourselves, today we have all the technologies that the panelists spoke about that we can tap into in terms of empowering ourselves. It is about the will of our people. It is about bringing that South Africanness whenever we are challenged to be able to rise up to this challenge. We have our own Berlin Wall that we're facing. And what do we do about it? It is all up to us to be able to make that choice. We can either sink or we can rise up and we can make this a better country and a better economy. And we all can play a role in doing so. On that score, I thank you once again for another show of Inspirate. And thank you for watching. And we look forward to you being around for many other shows in this series. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.